Welcome back to Keep Up. This is Cynthia Dill, your host. It's Monday, June 16th, and I'm very pleased to have as my guest today, Kara Dansky. She is a lawyer, author, feminist, and recently wrote the Democratic Women's Declaration. Welcome to the show, Kara Dansky.
Hi, thanks so much.
Well, I'm in Maine, and in Maine, there's a lot happening around gender identity. The Maine legislature has taken up several bills. Most of them, unfortunately, will get defeated. But the issue in Maine is boys playing on girls' sports teams, but also just the sort of what I consider to be the intrusion of gender identity into our society. And in my view, it's discriminatory against women. And I think we share some common ground on that. So I want to talk about that with you. But before we get started, in case some of the viewers don't know too much about you, could you give me a little bit of background on what you've been doing in your life and what brings you to this issue of women's rights and gender identity?
Sure. So I have been a registered Democrat since 1990. I am still a registered Democrat. The only time I have not been a registered Democrat was in the early 2000s when I was registered Green. So I am on the political left. As Cynthia said, I'm a feminist. And after graduating from law school, I'll say I studied feminism in both college and law school. But then after graduating from law school, my career went in a different direction. And I had a nearly 20-year career in criminal justice law and policy, including 2 years as senior counsel at the ACLU's Center for Justice. And in 2015, I joined the organization Women's Liberation Front, which is a radical feminist organization that fights on a number of fronts. But one of the fronts it fights on is getting gender identity out of US law, policy, and practice. I served on the board of that organization from 2016 to 2020. And the group Women's Declaration International was launched in the UK in 2019 and the US chapter in 2020. And I served as president and board of directors of that organization from 2021 to 2024. And backing up a little bit, I'll just say that in 2019, my nearly 20-year career in criminal law and criminal justice policy came crashing down because of some things I had said publicly on the topic of women's rights.
Wow. So that's a very pertinent background to have to inform, I think, some of the Maine legislators who, like I said, are on the cusp. Like the vote could be happening right now. And we've had almost tie votes, and we've had one bill that would prohibit boys from playing on girls' sports teams pass the House, but it looks like it might be headed to defeat in the Senate. So there's only been 4 Democrats who have crossed the line to support women's rights. And so first, I'm just in some of the materials that I've read that you have authored, you talk about the lie of gender identity. And could you expand on that a little bit? Why do you think, because in Maine, we inserted gender identity as a protected class in 2019. And it wasn't because anyone from the public came forward and said, oh, I've been discriminated against on the basis of my gender identity. It was just pushed by a special interest group whose executive director at the time happened to be the majority leader of the Democrats. So all of a sudden, we have several really bad laws in Maine, all focused and sort of sprung from this notion of gender identity being a protected class. So from your perspective, given all that background that you've just described, what is the lie of gender identity?
So it's good to start from the perspective of differentiating between sex and gender. So from a feminist perspective, gender is a set of sex stereotypes. It's the stereotypes that say girls have to like pink and Barbie dolls and boys have to like blue and trucks. So we refer to gender as a prison, essentially, of sex stereotypes. And feminists radical feminists at least, will not use the word gender to mean sex, even though a lot of people in society do use the term gender as a synonym for sex. But we use the word sex when we mean sex. So the reason that I say that so-called gender identity is a lie is that the truth of the matter is that there are 2 sexes, female and male, and all 8 billion people on the face of the planet are either female or male, including people who are born with what are called differences of sexual development. And that matters. It matters for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with feminism, but it certainly matters for feminism because we cannot protect women and girls as a sex class if we can't say what women and girls mean or what the word sex means. So this whole concept of so-called gender identity just kind of arose out of, it came really originally from male sexologists who were conducting what I would call unethical experiments on young people. And it morphed into this idea that anybody, and the United States government will say, well, not the current one, but the Biden administration would say everybody has a gender identity. Now, I will say it's not a lie in the sense that some people claim to have gender identities. I get that. The problem is that it's not real. It's not grounded in material reality. And laws such as the one you described in Maine that enshrine so-called gender identity as a protected characteristic effectively make it so that any male can invade women's sports, women's spaces, can be housed in women's prisons on the basis that they call themselves women, or they claim to have what I refer to as a woman gender identity, but they're not women. Calling oneself a woman doesn't make one a woman. Adopting the sex stereotypes of femininity does not make a man a woman. And taking hormones and surgeries does not turn a man into a woman. So that's why I say it's a lie.
It's hard to have these conversations when we bring kids into the fold, but that's really where we're at in Maine because, for instance, the one Republican senator who voted, against the bill that would have prohibited boys from playing on girls' sports says that, we have to look at our better angels and be inclusive and, lift up kids who are different. But I agree with you. It is a lie. And it seems to me particularly difficult for Democrats to get the issue straight in their minds because there's a real conflict between women's rights and the rights of the gender identity people and Democrats, because Democrats have long been the party, allegedly, for, fighting for women's rights. And I don't feel like the Democrats are representing women and girls in this area anymore. So what is the conflict? Why are the Democrats so captured by this gender identity cult? It's. Do you have any insight as to why? I could say our party, but I dropped out of the Democratic Party for this issue because if a party can't recognize the reality of my sex, if Democrats don't acknowledge that women are real and that sex matters, then I'm not going to be supporting Democrats. So you're a Democrat and you're still, fighting this good fight, but talk to me more about the conflict between gender identity, women's rights, and Democrats.
So this has been going on for a pretty long time. And I would note that 2012 was a pivotal year in the advancement of the notion that people have gender identities. So in 2012, a couple of things happened. One thing that happened in 2012 is that a young man named Tim McBride, who was serving as student body president at American University, decided that he's a woman named Sarah. And announced that he's Sarah and told everyone to use she, her pronouns. Now, the person who is now Representative Sarah McBride in the United States Congress representing Delaware knows the Biden family very well. The person I will call Tim served as President Biden's oldest son. I'm not talking about Hunter. I'm talking about a man named Beau who tragically died of cancer, I think, in 2015. But he was Attorney General for Delaware. And Tim McBride worked very closely with him. He was Beau Biden's personal assistant and driver. And in 2015, Jill Biden gave a speech at the annual gala of the Human Rights Campaign in which she went on at some length about how close the Biden family is with the McBride family. So in 2012, Tim becomes Sarah. And after he graduates, he gets an internship at the Obama-Biden White House. So right away from the get-go, McBride is involved in the federal government through an internship that I don't know how he got, but I would be surprised if it didn't somehow involve President Biden. The same year is the year that President Biden first began saying that transgender rights are the civil rights issue of our time. So something major was going on in 2012 with Biden. And the other thing that happened is that in 2003, Congress passed the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is a great bill. It got tremendous bipartisan support. It was signed into law by President Bush, and it was intended to eliminate rape in prisons. And in 2012, the Obama administration finally got around to implementing regulations that said that prisoners, transgender prisoners, could be housed in the women's prison. So this has been going on for a while, at least since 2012, even though most people had no idea it was happening until, probably the last couple of years or so. The why question is a little bit complicated, but it really boils down to follow the money. When you look into this, this is an industry. It's a multi-billion, at least it might have reached trillion-dollar industry that is essentially being pushed by mostly men, but plenty of women who are very wealthy and who are affiliated with pharma, medical supply companies, a lot of tech, and one man named Martine Rothblatt, who was named Martin at birth, and now he calls himself a woman named Martine. He has an insane amount of money, and he pushes this. He once published a book called From Transgender to Transhuman. Another man to be aware of is a man named John Stryker. John Stryker is heir to the Stryker Medical Corporation, and Stryker set up a foundation called Arcus, where he does nothing. No, I have to amend that. He's got one thing where he funds projects in Africa for great ape sanctuaries, which is I don't know what that's about, but he funds projects in the United States that advance so-called trans or queer projects. What he will say is that he advances so-called LGBT projects. But when you do a deep dive into what the Arcus Foundation funds, it's almost exclusively trans and queer projects. So there is a ton of money behind this. And of course, it's not just the Democrats. I'm very angry at my party leadership, but it's not just the Democrats themselves. It's not just lawmakers. It is the entire institutional left. It is my former employer, the ACLU. It is the Human Rights Campaign. And it's even some of the mainstream feminist organizations, the National Organization for Women, Planned Parenthood, the Women's March, the National Women's Law Center, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights all proclaim that some men are women if they say so. And I'll just add briefly, I literally learned yesterday that the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which was launched in 1977 in San Francisco as the Lesbian Rights Project, has the acronym NCLR, right? National Center for Lesbian Rights. They threw women and girls under the bus years ago, but just last week, they have officially and formally changed their name to the National Center for LGBTQ Rights. So they kept the acronym NCLR. So that sort of allows them to pretend to actually care about lesbians. But they really just care about men with woman gender identities.
So that sounds like a tough opponent in a political battle on the left. All those groups that you just mentioned are the strongest special interest groups in Democratic politics here in Maine, and I'm sure everywhere else. So are there groups that are aligned with you that are speaking truth to power, and are you getting any traction?
So here's the thing. Most people, and this is because of our mainstream legacy media outlets, the mainstream legacy media outlets always paint this as the big bad Christian right over here oppressing a tiny marginalized community over here. That's the mainstream legacy media narrative. And they've been doing it for a very long time now. So There are conservative groups, of course, that will speak out against this, and they frequently get a platform in the mainstream legacy media because that helps the mainstream legacy media propagate the lie that it's, again, the big bad Christian right over here, tiny marginalized community over here. In fact, we know from polling that this issue played a role in getting Donald Trump elected to his second term as president. We know from polling that 67% of Democrats across the country do not want men and boys in sports intended for women and girls. And there are feminist organizations, including, as mentioned, I think I mentioned, the Women's Liberation Front, on whose board I served from 2016 to 2020, and WDI USA, Women's Declaration International USA. So we fight very hard, and we fight for women and girls as a sex class. Both are grounded in radical feminist analysis, but we don't get any traction in the media. The media prefers to completely ignore the fact that we exist because we would undermine their narrative that this is the big bad Christian right against a tiny marginalized community. So they ignore us. On the very few occasions when they have given us a platform, they paint us as stooges of the right, even though we all have very lefty credentials and we're not stooges of the right, and we're mostly not Republicans. So it's been very hard to get any traction in the media. I've gotten a couple pieces published in the media, which I'm happy to send to you if you want to provide links, and that's good. But I cannot tell you the number of hours I have spent over the course of the past decade writing op-eds and letters to the editor and sending them off to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they go completely ignored.
Well, in Maine, it's the same thing. I mean, you'd think that, there's nobody believes that sex is real. And every story that's published is about, describing this legislation that is really to protect the rights of women and girls, describing it as anti-trans, describing, young kids as, a trans girl. I just find that the language around this issue is just, it's so oppressive, and it's like forced speech. We have to call people by what they say and use words that, in my view, are not true. So, in terms of the media, I mean, what's the answer? I mean, is it social media? I mean, do we need to just be online? Because it seems to me a lot of these kids who believe now, because they've been taught this idea that somehow it's normal to be disassociated, to have a disassociation between your body and soul. I mean, it's just, I have two children. One is my son is in a relationship with a beautiful woman, and my daughter is in a relationship with a beautiful woman. And they both grew up in the same household with adoring parents. And somehow the narrative is that my daughter's part now of a marginalized community. It's like she's an analyst at a really good company. And, it's so frustrating that the language that is used by the media. So social media plays, obviously plays a big part. And we've had some, I think, a little bit of light shine from the UK with the ruling from their highest court defining, sex, women on the basis of biological sex. Do you think social media or what's happening in England is going to somehow be a counterweight towards the capture that we've seen in the legacy media here and all the organizations that you just described, who seem to be just they seem to be completely captured by the idea that sex isn't real. And it's so ironic because we're on the heels of this pandemic where the issue that separated Democrats and Republicans was Democrats saying we have to follow the science and everything has to be science-based, and this is so not science-based. So do you think social media it might be the answer? I mean, you've penned the Democratic Women's Declaration as a response. Talk to me about what the response can look like.
Yeah, so I'm very active on social media, in part because I think of it as a news source these days. Yeah, social media will play a huge role. And, speaking of England, there's a reason it's called Turf Island, right? They've got J.K. Rowling. We don't have a J.K. Rowling over here. And tragically, in my view, where are the women? You know, where's Meryl Streep? Where's our J.K. Rowling? Why aren't our famous women with large platforms stepping up? These women are uncancelable. Bette Midler tried it once. Macy Gray tried it once, and they both immediately backtracked. So that's a little bit frustrating. We have a case coming up called United States versus Skermetti, and it could come down from the Supreme Court any day now. And many of us are very hopeful that, like the UK Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court will come out with a ruling that sex is real and it's immutable, and the words woman and man are not actually confusing.
Could you
So,
tell me a little bit more about that case?
sure. So the state of Tennessee enacted a law that prohibits the administration of puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones for minors. And a group of minors who call themselves trans and their parents sued the state in federal court, and they won at the lowest level. But then something very interesting happened. The state appealed, and the relevant appellate court is the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals took a really interesting, nuanced view of the case and ended up publishing in September of 2023 a very strong opinion holding that a state like Tennessee may enact such a law prohibiting puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones. And in that ruling, it was very clear that so-called trans is not an immutable trait. That's the word they use. They ruled that trans is not a politically powerless group. And so basically, in the course of this ruling, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals essentially ruled exactly in the way that I wanted it to. And I should say, full disclosure, I was a lawyer representing Women's Declaration International USA, which filed a brief in the case, essentially asking the Sixth Circuit to do exactly what it did. And then the United States, thank you. The United States got involved under the Biden administration on the side of the students, the minors who were challenging the law. The minors had been represented by the ACLU, and they still are, but the United States government under Biden asked the Supreme Court to review the case, and the Supreme Court said yes. Now, obviously, we have a very different United States government right now, but when the case was argued back in December, it was still under the Biden administration. So the United States was arguing before the Supreme Court essentially that sex isn't real. The ACLU got some time to put forth its arguments that sex isn't real before the Supreme Court. A lawyer by the name of Chase Strangio, who is a woman who calls herself a man, works at the ACLU, and Chase was able to put forth the ACLU's arguments before the Supreme Court. So that was back in December when arguments happened, and we're waiting for a decision literally any day now. A lot of people thought it would come down last Thursday, and I sat at my computer with my eyes glued to the Supreme Court site to see if they were going to announce it, and they didn't.
If you had to just summarize what the argument is that sex isn't real, I mean, what is their best case?
It gets a little complicated legally, but it hinges on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Again, it's very complicated, but there are various categories of people and characteristics that the federal courts use to examine claims of discrimination. So claims of discrimination on the basis of race are governed by one set of standards, and claims of discrimination on the basis of sex are governed by another set of standards. And what the ACLU really wanted was for the courts to create a new category of transgender to have the same standard for evaluation as that of either race or sex. And then they also said that even if the courts didn't do that, that Tennessee's law just violated the Equal Protection Clause because it discriminates on the basis of sex. Most of us are quite hopeful that the Supreme Court will rule in support of Tennessee.
And other than that case, I mean, it seems to me women have standing to challenge some of these laws on the basis of sex. Are you aware of any other cases that are, percolating up from just women plaintiffs challenging laws on the basis of discrimination on the basis of sex?
There's one case in which a group of women at a sorority challenged their sorority in federal court because the sorority admitted a man who claims to have a woman identity, and they ended up losing, and that case is over. There's a case currently pending in which a female-only spa outside of Seattle has been forced to allow a man who calls himself a woman, and the courts have ruled that Washington state law requires this female-only spa. By the way, this is a nude spa. Nudity is expected. Women are walking around in various states of undress. And this man decided that that violated his rights under state law. And the federal courts agreed with him that it does violate his rights under state law. And that case went before the Ninth Circuit, which ruled that way. WDI USA, again, filed a friend of the court brief arguing that sex is real and that it matters, and that a female-only spa ought to be permitted to exclude naked men. And the Ninth Circuit disagreed with us. And now the parties are in the process of deciding whether the case will be reheard before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So that's currently percolating. I'm not aware of other cases where women are legally challenging these types of laws. There are many other cases where individuals who call themselves trans are challenging these laws. And so the Supreme Court is currently trying to decide whether to take two cases involving sports where male athletes have, three. Male athletes are demanding to be able to compete in sports intended for women and girls, but they live in states where that is prohibited. So these male athletes are challenging the laws in federal court, and we're waiting to see if the Supreme Court will take one of them.
This is an observation, and I don't know if you're aware of any studies, but I mean, I'm not hearing a lot of so-called trans men banging the doors of courthouses or demanding entry into single-sex spaces. Is it mostly a push by men who identify as women, as far as you can tell?
Interestingly, when it comes to prisons, there are male prisoners being housed in women's prisons all over this country on the basis of their so-called woman gender identities, which I just think is, it needs to be a national scandal. And it is absolutely shameful that our mainstream legacy media outlets are not covering these cases. And in the prison context, you're right. Most women who call themselves men are not clamoring to get into the men's prison because they know they're unsafe there. However, when it comes to single-sex spaces, I can think off the top of my head of 3 cases in which a female student sued her school because the school refused to allow her to be in the boys' bathroom. And that issue has never been before the Supreme Court.
We have a law in Maine that was passed a couple years ago, and it's similar to the one in England, to mandate public corporations to have gender parity on their boards, and then defines female to mean anyone who self-identifies as a woman, regardless of biology. So, I mean, I just find that so offensive, and it's such a loophole. Like, okay, so we could have a so-called, gender parity and have all men. And the definition of female is just counter to everything that science and nature and our naked eye suggests is real. So it's incredibly frustrating, and I would hope that some women would take up a case and just and bring it forward. And from my own perspective, if you're an adult and you have your own insurance and you want to identify, if you're a man and you want to identify as a woman, all the power to you. I support the Supreme Court's decision, I think it's Bostock, that says you can't be discriminated against in employment on the basis of sexual orientation, and gender identity is included in that. I'm fine with that. I mean, that's employment discrimination. But when it comes to, defining in law female to include men, it's just crazy to me. It's absolutely crazy. I just I hope, and this is so ironic again, because people were so concerned that Mitch McConnell was orchestrating the Supreme Court to be this, right-wing Christian nationalist court. And I think the Supreme Court is going to be the body that saves us from this madness. Do you have hope that the Supreme Court is going to, be clear-eyed and recognize the science that men are men and women are women? I mean, you talk about it, and this is a good segue into the Democratic Women's Declaration. I mean, women for years were basically chattel, could not vote, and we fought to have equal rights under the law on the basis of sex, Title IX, the right to vote. And here we are again, almost just fighting for survival. There's an existential threat to women's rights. Are you hopeful that the makeup currently of the Supreme Court is going to be our savior?
I mean, look, I'm not happy about the makeup of the Supreme Court, right? I am no fan of Justice Alito, who authored the decision in Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade. But I will say, and I want to get back to the topic of adults can do whatever they want if they have their own insurance. But just on this topic, I am not a huge fan of Bostock. And the reason is because of something Justice Alito said in dissent in Bostock. Because the Supreme Court, as you say, the Supreme Court decided in Bostock that you can't discriminate in employment against someone for, quote, being transgender. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't tell us what it meant by being transgender. And President Biden spent 4 years telling everyone in America that Bostock stood for the proposition that so-called gender identity is included in the definition of sex, which the Supreme Court didn't even do. I don't like Bostock, but it's not as crazy as that. But the Biden administration told everybody that Bostock means that sex includes gender identity for all purposes. In his dissent in Bostock, Justice Alito said that the federal judiciary will be mired for years in litigation about what Bostock means. And he was 8,000% right. I don't like agreeing with Justice Alito, but he was right. But I am hopeful that under the current makeup of the Supreme Court, we'll get a positive outcome in the Scrimetti case, which is the one that we could hear about any day. Just on the topic of people being able to do what they want, I get that. I am a traditional lefty. I am totally down for people not conforming with sex stereotypes. But I think we have to be very careful, in part because it's a little bit too easy. If men are going to not conform to sex stereotypes, cool, but that doesn't make them women. And so far, they've been able to argue that that makes them women and that that's enough to be able to access female-only bathrooms, changing room, locker rooms, etc. And the other reason I worry about it, there's a category of women who don't get talked about enough in these discussions, and they're the women who are referred to as trans widows. Are you familiar with that term?
No.
So these are women whose male partners, whether they're husbands or boyfriends, decide they're women. And life is hell for these women because their male partners expect them to go along with their sexual fetish, expect them to play along in the bedroom, expect their female partners to consider themselves lesbians, which is really, a mind trip for a woman who's married a man. So I worry that the whole do what you want if you're an adult position sort of doesn't pay enough attention to the women who are being impacted this in their personal lives and relationships and their kids.
What do you think the people like Caitlyn Jenner and some of these online influencers, mostly, boys and men identifying as women, what do you think the impact of these celebrities has on this issue?
I think it's terrible. I think that when Vanity Fair featured Mr. Jenner on the cover of its magazine, it was part of this ongoing assault on all of our minds. It was meant to make us think that trans is real, that the word trans woman has some sort of meaning other than a man who calls himself a woman. So we're sort of back to the media again, but I really do think that since at least the early 2010s, our entire society has been treated to a steady stream of the media narrative that some men are women, and gender's part of that.
And some men are women, and now it's some kids at the age of 2 can somehow have a belief that they were born in the wrong body. And that's what really, really bothers me is, as I said earlier, it's normalizing this concept that it's okay to be disassociated between body and soul. It's against everything that I stand for in terms of my own personal values about, you're encouraging kids to love their body, love your body as your temple. It takes care. To me, it's just reversed sexism to suggest to these kids that, oh, if you're a young girl and you are a tomboy and you have other traits that are typically associated with boys, that the answer is not to just own it and be proud of yourself as a girl, but to transition and become a boy. It's just ass backwards as far as I'm concerned. One thing that you have done, in addition to all the other really admirable things that you've done, you've written books, litigated cases, been on the media as much as you can, but you also authored the Democratic Women's Declaration, which I think was published in October of 24. So talk to me a little bit about that. What prompted you to write this? And to viewers, I will put a link to it in the comments of this show, but talk to me about the Democratic Women's Declaration and what motivated you to write this document that has an introduction and then like 10 articles. It's pretty easy to read, and I encourage everyone to read it.
Thank you. Let me just say real quick before getting to that, it's really important that everyone, but especially parents, understand that this stuff is in your kids' schools. Your kids are being taught that, exactly as Cynthia said, if you're a girl and you like blue and trucks, then you're a boy. And yes, it is absolutely regressive sex stereotypes. It annoys me to no end that this is always framed as a progressive issue. It's not. As we've kind of been alluding to, it is sexist, it is homophobic, it is authoritarian, and it's capitalism on steroids. It is the most regressive movement I have seen in my lifetime. Okay, so there is a document called the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. This was launched in the UK by UK radical feminists in 2019, and it lays out its own set of articles about how politicians can be thinking about protecting women and girls as a sex class in law, policy, and practice. Inspired by that, women in the UK's Labour Party and Green Party wrote their own declarations. So there's the Labour Women's Declaration and the Green Women's Declaration. These are all grounded in radical feminism. These are all lefty women, and they wrote their own declarations to try to move their own parties, their left-leaning parties in the UK, to accept and grasp and protect women's sex-based rights. So for several years, people were asking me, well, Kara, do we have a Democratic Women's Declaration? And I was like, no. So then finally, I was like, all right, if we're going to have one, I guess I'm just going to have to write it. So I did. And as you say, it was launched actually the day after the election. It was launched the day after the presidential election, and it explains the leftist, radical feminist critique of so-called gender identity and the importance of protecting women and girls as a sex class. I just want to also say, you mentioned at the beginning, you've got 4 Democrats in Maine who have crossed the aisle, and you said it's only 4. I just want to say yay to those 4. 4 is a lot given where we are in this political climate. So congratulations and thank you to those Democrats who crossed the aisle to vote to protect women's sex-based rights in Maine.
Well, I'm so grateful to them. I don't think they're going to be able to cross the finish line. But before I apologize, there's some video that's loud in the background. I hope it's not disturbing anybody. What is a radical feminist?
A radical feminist is a feminist who, in the current climate, fights for the sex-based rights of women and girls as a sex class. The work that the word radical is doing there has to do with getting to the root. If you look at the Latin, the etymology of the word radical, it doesn't mean extremist. It doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means. It means getting to the root of the problem. And from a radical feminist perspective, men as a class oppressing women as a class is the root of the problem. And we fight against that in a number of ways. It's not only gender identity. Radical feminists, if we didn't have to be constantly fighting this gender identity thing, we would be taking on the pornography industry. We'd be taking on sex trafficking and prostitution. We would be taking on abortion rights. I fought hard for abortion rights my whole life. And so the end of Roe v. Wade is a tragedy. So anyway, we fight on a number of fronts, but right now, this whole idea that sex isn't real and that women and girls don't exist as a sex class has to be the priority for many of us.
And what can people do? Is there an opportunity to support this Democratic Women's Declaration?
Certainly go to it, read it, sign it if you agree. It's in its very early stages. As mentioned, it was launched last fall. I've gotten a couple women behind the scenes working on it. We're trying to figure out what direction it's going to take. So if anyone wants to get involved, that would be great. In the meantime, you're more than welcome to donate to WDI USA. They're always looking for help. Court cases aren't free. Legal briefs aren't free, so they're always looking for financial support. And also, if you want to, check out my Substack, which is called The Turf Report. And I've got a little thing in Substack that enables you to unlock a free subscription. I do have paid subscribers, and I pay for a lot of my more meaty content, but it enables you to unlock a free subscription for a week. And just check out my content, see what you think.
And where do people follow you on social media?
At Kara Dansky on X. And I think I'm just Kara Dansky on Facebook. And I haven't gotten around to getting active on Instagram yet. I get yelled at all the time to get active on Instagram. And I just feel like I'm middle-aged. I don't know that I want to take on another social media platform, but I am very active on X.
There is a big generational gap, I think, on this issue. Like the Pew research that just came out said like 66% of transgendered people are under the age of 30. I just find that just to be like a fascinating statistic. And it leads me to believe, this is my hypothesis, that it was during COVID when these young people were stuck online and these influencers were, just these TikTok videos. I don't know. This is just a theory, but the generational gap is something that we need to overcome. So maybe we do both need to get on Instagram.
Absolutely. I have not seen the data, but I strongly suspect you're right, that it was during COVID that this just exploded.
Well, Kara Dansky, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we can talk again, and especially after is it Skrmetti case?
Skrmetti, Skrmetti. He's the Attorney General for Tennessee. So that's how his name got involved in the case.
Well, thanks again. And I wish you the best of luck in all your work. And I will be signing on to the Democratic Women's Declaration and continue to advocate for, sex-based reality here in the state of Maine.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
You too.